Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I've just learnt that old MacDonald has turned his farm into a brand new company and made himself the CIEIO. And that's a very funny joke about a nursery rhyme. But why is the old bald man who's presenting this programme telling us this rubbish, I hear you saying? And first of all, can I just add, how rude you sometimes are. But it's a valid question. Well, it's one of the wonderful things about Musical Talk. You start off at one point and it takes you somewhere completely unexpected. And so today we're going to range from this opening joke about old MacDonald having a farm to the main subject of the conversation, which is a show that you could have seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2019. The show was called Wit and Mirth, and it was written and presented by an old friend of this programme, William Hughes. Now, you'll remember in last week's episode, you heard my conversation with him about his 2018 Edinburgh Festival show, Elizabethan. And in that conversation, he told me that at that point he was starting to plan for his next show, his offering for the 2019 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and that would be taking a leap of about a century in terms of musical development to do a show based on the songs included in a book called Wit and Mirth, written and compiled by a man called Thomas Durfee. Which gives us the opportunity here in Musical Talk then to hear the sequel to that conversation about Elizabethan, his first show, when I spoke to him about Wit and Mirth, which was another great show from David, one I really enjoyed and was even more accessible than Elizabethan because the music was easier to understand. Now, in that show, Wit and Mirth, David sang a number of songs that he had taken from the book Wit and Mirth by Thomas Durfee from the early 18th century, and added a few of his own, written more recently of course, but in the same ribald style. But you may still be wondering where old MacDonald had a farm comes into this narrative at all. Well, the answer is, as I was researching the life of Thomas Durfee, I discovered that he is attributed with the earliest version of the rhyme that went on to become Old MacDonald Had a Farm. He wrote it for an opera in 1706 called The Wonders of the Sun or The Kingdom of the Birds. And whilst it's not exactly the same as the song we know today as Old MacDonald, it has that part in the middle, the catch if you like, and he talks about taking his cows to be milked once a year, with a booing here and a booing there, here a boo, there a boo, everywhere a boo, which of course is just another onomatopoeic word for moo, or the sound that a cow makes. So that all-important element, the catch of that nursery rhyme, does appear to originate with Thomas Durfee, and was sung to a melody not dissimilar to the one we know today. I've even found a record of the person who introduced it to the British public. Her name was an actress known as Miss Mary Willis, who was an actress, a singer and a dancer, and she appeared in the opera The Wonders in the Sun or The Kingdom of the Birds, and introduced it on the 5th of April 1706 at the Queen's Theatre. And, fact fans, and this is how far the research goes, she was paid a princely sum of £40 annually for working at that theatre, having been taken on by its manager, Owen Swiney. Now, as it happens, the opera wasn't very successful, but Durfee included that song, written by him, in his own book, Wit and Mirth, and it was used again in other comic operas in the 18th century, including one by John Gay, called Polly, from 1729. And if the name John Gay means something to you, it certainly should, because he was the man behind The Beggar's Opera, who many people identify as being the first step on the road to modern musical theatre. Written in 1728, produced by a man called John Rich at the Lincoln's Inn Fields Theatre. It's also responsible for one of the earliest musical theatre jokes, because such was the success of this ballad opera that as early as its fifth performance, it was being said publicly that the Beggar's Opera had made rich very gay and will probably make gay very rich. A play on both the names of the two people behind it. And John Rich made so much money from the show that he was able to build a theatre in Covent Garden. So let's get this episode back on track. In a minute, we're going to hear from David William Hughes about his wonderful show called Wit and Mirth, which is, as I've already said, a one-man show that he created, which included songs from that original early 18th century book by Thomas D'Urfey and a few songs by David himself. But isn't it interesting to know that there's a connection between Thomas D'Urfey, the Beggar's Opera, and Old MacDonald Had a Farm, a song which I don't think any of us probably knew came from an opera in 1706 and written by Thomas D'Urfey himself. Well, I've done quite enough explanation, even if it has been rather on the wide-ranging side. So let's get down to the main element of today's programme. In just a minute, you're going to hear a couple of edited extracts from David's one-man show Wit and Mirth, which I hope will get you in the mood. It also includes a song, one of the songs from the D'Urfey book, and then we'll hear the conversation with David William Hughes himself, who is not only a great performer, he's also a great academic and really knows what he's talking about in terms of the historic context and the musical development that underpins the success of these songs from the book when they were originally compiled. So, let's hear David in action.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this show is called Wit and Mirth, which might seem like I'm massively over-promising for a one-man cabaret based on 300-year-old material, but it is, in fact, the title of this book, which I have borrowed, not stolen, from the Harvard Library. This book by a man called Thomas D'Urfey, or later in life, Thomas D'Urfey. So he actually changed his name and put an apostrophe after the first letter to make it sound more French and more sophisticated. How about that, ladies and gentlemen? A grasshopper and a fly in summer hot and dry, in eager argument were met to talk about priority. Says the fly to the grasshopper, from mighty race I spring. Bright Phoebus was my dad, 'tis true, and I eat and drink with a king. Says the grasshopper to the fly, shucks, rogues are still preferred. Your father may be of a high degree, but your mother was just a turd. That's Henry Purcell and Thomas D'Urfey, 1698.
My name is David William Hughes. I go by that name because there's an Australian comedian called David Hughes, so don't get us confused. And I'm here with two shows at the Edinburgh Fringe. I've got Elizabethan at 6:05 p.m. at Surgeons Hall and Wit and Mirth at 10:15 p.m. at Bar 50.
Now, listeners will remember that I saw Elizabethan last year and thought it was a cracking show. I still do, by the way. And it's had a little bit of a world tour, would that be the right way of describing it? It's certainly, it's moved a bit, isn't it?
It's been around the world. So off the back of last year's Edinburgh Fringe, I got invited to perform at the Adelaide Fringe, which was really exciting. So I went and did Elizabethan there in February. And because I live in Boston, I've also done it there and in New York and in the countryside near Boston. So if it's been to 3 continents, not quite the whole world, but there's some stepping stones there, aren't there?
I mean, tell me, obviously, I thought it was an extremely accomplished show last year. Have you had in any way to tweak it or twiddle it? Is it more or less the same show from last year, or has it developed substantially?
So I think it had its main development just before you saw it. In the sort of first week of Edinburgh last year, I rewrote about the first 10-15 minutes of the show and changed it a lot. Since then, there's just a few jokes that have changed, a few that have been cut out, a few bits that have come back in, but it's essentially the same show that it was when you saw it last year.
And I suppose because we should never forget that you are both an academic and a performer in this particular sphere. You know this music backwards. Has singing those particular songs, the ones you've set into the story of Elizabethan, given you any greater insight in those songs through repetitive singing, or are you heartily sick of them? Because, forgive me, I'm interested to know what you think, but also I remember last year, and I was very struck by this, but you were saying that you could detect even just from one listen as an audience which were the more sophisticated songs.
I think, yes, perhaps not in an academic sense, but certainly in a musical sense, the repetition has brought a lot out. I think the more you perform the same songs, they become almost subconscious, and therefore it becomes easier and easier to change how you perform day to day. You know, am I loud in this verse, quiet in that verse? Do I stop for a pause here? How do I want to do that? And just through being more and more at ease, singing everything, that's easier to do.
So you've actually absorbed the songs in a strange kind of way, which actually allows for, as you say, variation of performance.
Yes. Now that I've done the show enough, I don't have to try to remember them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Do you think that's a way of keeping it? Because there's a danger, isn't there, I suppose? There's a danger of repetition, which is things can get stale, but as you say, you can also keep things fresh by finding new twists and turns or ways of developing things. So,
I think in the case of Elizabethan, what keeps it fresh is the fact that there are 3 audience volunteers involved, and they are always different. So, and I sing with and to them. So a lot of how the songs go depends on their reaction and how they interact with me and the music. And that is always different. So that certainly prevents any staleness, yes.
Did you find any continental differences on that, by the way? Let's talk continents, why not? Let's have a big scope.
That's a good question. Not really. I mean, they're all English-speaking lands, and I suppose they all share the heritage of that era. I mean, this is just when America is beginning to be settled by British people, and when Britons have not even heard of Australia yet. But I think from anyone who has a sort of English language background, especially through education and having so much Shakespeare in school and things like that, that particular era is this kind of
locked in.
Locked
into our sort of understanding.
Locked into our understanding, yeah. And I think everyone perhaps feels connected to that era and feels they know something about it, perhaps more than other times in English history or English literature.
Well, it's funny actually what you were talking about America sort of hoving into view in the cultural sense in a British or English, I suppose, in those days sense, because I'm thinking back to my own sort of schoolboy history. You think, when does America sort of turn up? And it's when Sir Walter Raleigh brings back tobacco, and it's famously from America and Virginia, and it's named after Virginia, obviously named after Queen Elizabeth I, the famous virgin. So yes, you're right. It's sort of it's all there, isn't it?
It's all there in that founding. It's that kind of time, yeah. And tobacco's, as you know, an important thing that happens in the show. So
I do.
Yeah.
Can I also ask then, because it's been observed by academics, of course, that the use of English in different countries has spun off quite understandably in different ways, and it's often alleged that some American accents are closer to the original Shakespearean. Does that have any bearing on your performances, particularly in America? Or is that just lovely background noise?
I think that's really interesting, and there are some performances of this music you can listen to in sort of period accents, and where you notice it most, I suspect, is where things no longer rhyme, where they would have done in the original accent. I find when performing in the States, keeping it as British as possible is a good selling point, so that's what I do, because, lots of American audiences love the British accent, and that's a selling point. So,
well, it is Brit wit, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think it would probably be more accurate to not do it in a modern British accent.
But of course, you've also got to make yourself.
But I've got to make myself understood, and
yeah.
Yes, so.
Because obviously, to our modern ears, we would default quite wrongly, I'm sure, to kind of sort of Mummerzette accent. So if you came on in that sort of deep West Country, my love,
yes,
it would all be. It might send it up earlier than it needed to be sent up.
I think also perhaps, if you don't want to focus too much on the accent which might distract from other things. And I'm sure in those days there must have been different regional accents, just like we have now, I expect.
And dialects, of course,
and dialects,
as well, yes.
yeah.
And I think there's a fairly famous linguistic story about someone from the north coming to the south and asking for eggs, and the term is so alien.
Yeah, I think
even within one island.
Yeah, that's right. I think they say, and the southerner says iron, which is like closer to the German. So, yeah.
But Elizabethan is not your only show.
That's right, yes.
You also have Wit and Mirth, which
That's
I had
right.
the pleasure of seeing the other day and adored. I thought it was fantastic. So would you care to briefly explain what the unique selling points of Wit and Mirth are?
So Wit
Presumably
and...
there's two. There's both Mirth and Wit. But
Well,
let's expand upon that.
Wit and Mirth is actually the title of a book, which is 300 years old, by a man called Thomas Durfee. And in its time, it was one of England's biggest selling publications, and was a smash hit and sold out multiple editions and eventually ran to 6 volumes. And it's basically a collection of funny songs and stories and little excerpts from plays and speeches and things, kind of all-purpose entertainment book. And so the show is some of those songs and some of my own songs inspired by them, and an element of improvisation as well.
And I'm not coming back.
Bye.
So, well, let's divide it in two, because I tell you what I thought was so lovely about it was that you have a great rapport with your audience. I saw that in Elizabethan, but it really comes to the fore here because it is singularly you and a keyboard keeping us, the punters, entertained.
It's more like a stand-up show in a way than a play. So,
Oh yes, there's no narrative in that sense, is there? No. And you wouldn't think necessarily that sort of 21st century comic songs and 300, 400-year-old sort of... Because it's a collection, isn't it? They're not all by Thomas Durfee.
They're not all by him, and he also makes claim to have written some that he probably didn't.
Yes.
So
this one's good, it's got my name on it.
Yes.
But what I like is the fact that you're able to balance one with the other. You wouldn't necessarily think that those two periods would mesh as well as they do, and I think you're very good at finding golden threads and connections. So actually, although it's very clear that when you sing the older songs, they are older songs, you know, they have that sense about them, they're still accessible, and you've connected them with your sort of ongoing patter and your own lyrics. So was that difficult? I mean, had you written your comic songs before you decided on this show? So was it finding matches and pairs? Or did you think, actually, no, what would be a really good connection from this song to this song would be my new song here?
So there were a couple of my songs that existed previously, but most of them I tried to sort of write new songs on themes that I found in the Thomas Durfee songs. So that's kind of the loosely paired, one historical song and one modern song. And then what I've tried to do as well is with the historical songs perform them in quite a modern way, so with a piano, and trying to stylistically make them similar to what's happening nowadays, sort of thing.
Did you find that easier to do? Because I remember when we were talking about Elizabethan, you were saying the great thing about Renaissance music is it's beautiful and wonderful, but you do sort of need to understand the way that music worked in those days to get it. There's a sort of there's an extra step away from it, which you have to bridge, and then once you're in, it's lovely. Do you find it was easy? You know, these are 100, 200 years later.
I think
Was that easier?
Yes. So I think, historically speaking, 100 years after the Elizabethan period, you know, beginning of the 18th century, we're now in kind of the same musical language that we're still using today. So that makes it easier. I mean, it's basically, most of the songs are chords and a tune like you would have nowadays. Yes. The other part of it as well is that the Thomas Durfee songs are less artistic and less complicated simply. His songs are really more about an amusing poem, and rather than trying to be melodically complicated. And I think, you know, as a book, it's really written for people to sit around and sing them all together and have a laugh. It's not so artistic, perhaps.
Well, they're not parlour songs in the Victorian sense, are they? No, they're not quite rugby songs either, but they are perhaps closer to rugby than they are to parlour.
I think they're probably... Well, there's a mixture, but I imagine them being sung in bars or round the fireplace after a few beers or something like that.
Particularly rowdy evening in a coffee house.
Perhaps, yes.
I say rowdy, actually that's very unfair, because the songs, I really enjoyed the songs. I mean, would you care to identify one or two of the ones that you picked, and perhaps one or two that you would like to have done but were just a step away or too far? Or because I remember we had a slightly off the record chat, and you were saying that you had to distill it down to what you thought would work.
Yes, there is one of my favourite songs in the show is one called "The Fart," which is set at the royal court. And in the song, basically, someone farts, and then they go around the room trying to find out who did it, and of course they don't find out, and then they blame it on the dog. And that's great, because in the actual book, there's this chorus that comes back after every verse of fart noises, which is kind of unexpected and stupid and funny. And
hard to expect to see in a book, really.
Yeah, it's because that's quite amusing. And there's one about a boy who dies by trying to eat a custard too quickly, and those are quite fun ones. There's one I haven't got in there there's a nice one about a beard and how it sort of riffs on all the different ridiculous beard styles that people had, and I thought that might work because beards are pretty fashionable at the moment,
very topical, I'd say. Yes, fine.
But some of what you get with some of the problems is just things that would have been an everyday reference 300 years ago, no one knows about now. So sometimes that means you can't do a song, but sometimes, like in the fart song, I've just adjusted a few words here and there to make it more understandable.
To bridge that gap of disconnect, because it's always possible, isn't it? Age does this all the time. History just rolls on, as you'd expect, and therefore, the most popular song of 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago is either forgotten or will contain elements. Gilbert and Sullivan is now getting on. Some of their stuff's 150 years old, which I find staggering, or certainly in that region. Most of that stuff is still quite understandable, but there are references. I'll pick one out immediately. In Iolanthe, there is a whole song about Captain Shaw, and that's a reference to a very famous fireman of the Victorian era who became a great celebrity. Doesn't mean much now.
No.
And so you sort of have to know that, or at least get from the plot that he was famous, even if you don't know who he was. And that's only 150 years. We're talking 300 here.
Yeah.
And so, apart from everyone would have heard of Queen Anne or George I or whoever, I'm talking about, the celebrities of the day, and haven't lingered.
No, and I think that's marks the difference really between the songs that work and the songs that don't. So there are a lot of songs in the book that are sort of satires about people, prime ministers or lords that you've never heard of. But the ones that work now are the ones, about stuff that is universal, like someone farts and you've got to blame it on somebody because no one wants to own up to doing that. And
can I ask, because that song I think you can take in two ways, because you made a great observation in the show, and you've mentioned it there, but actually ultimately it's all blamed on the dog, and that is a joke that still runs through now. Even today I can remember a Kenny Everett sketch in the 1980s on television where someone breaks wind at a dinner party and they decide to blame it on the dog, and so Kenny, who's running the dinner party, stands up and shouts to the dog to leave the room, and so he opens the door and the dog runs in. So that's the joke on that one. But it is essentially still the same joke, or it's relating to a trope which is known.
Yeah.
But I suppose I've got to ask, could you read it that there's an interpretation that it was the Queen herself, Queen Anne, who's broken the wind, and therefore no one can possibly accept responsibility, whilst at the same time they can't pin it on the actual culprit, to use a schoolboy phrase.
That's quite possible, especially that Queen Anne had this reputation as a great glutton, and
she's not a delicate lady, I think.
I think not.
I'll ask Olivia Colman, who's just portrayed her, of course.
I have to say, in the original one, it's not the dog. Well, who they blame it on in the original song is the beefeater.
Oh.
Who's the guard.
Yeah.
So he gets the blame. I changed it to the dog because otherwise I'd have to do the subsequent song in the book, which is called The Beefeater's Reply.
Oh, right,
and
that
actually has a sequel, but I thought 2 songs about a fart would be too much for the show. But a
repeat offender, yes.
So it could well be, and there's another song which, I say in the show, it contains the world's oldest your mum joke. Whether it does or not, probably not, because that insulting people's mothers probably as old a time, isn't it? So, but Anald, your mum joke, and there's suspicion in that it's actually about, I think there's a duke of somewhere who was an illegitimate son of the king, and so it's saying, you know, I eat and drink with the king, yes, but it's rather more than just a simple your mum joke. It's a kind of swipe at this illegitimate offspring of royalty.
Because the one that immediately comes to mind, of course, is I think it's the Duke of Monmouth and Charles II with the Monmouth uprising.
That may be it, yes.
Which, oh gosh, aren't we good? If that's true. But you temper the songs, and I think you're right to do so, because the show has a magnificent pace. It comes fast and furious. But you temper the songs with your own songs, and as you say, they're thematically linked, or they sort of amplify or develop ideas. Now, how long have you been writing comic songs? Because I think they're extremely adroit. And I don't mean that with any kind of sort of backhanded, I was surprised. I mean, but it was very good. I said to you afterwards, but actually I got a sort of sense of Flanders and Swan, and I can think of no higher compliment. But you told me that your influences are actually, if you like, the American version of Flanders and Swan, who's Tom Lehrer.
Tom Lehrer. So as a child, yes, my grandmother actually loved playing Flanders and Swan records, and my father was a Tom Lehrer fan, so those were
perfect upbringing
among the records in the house. And then as a sort of teenager, I was one of those nerds who memorized Monty Python sketches, and of course Monty Python has some fantastic songs as well,
particularly on their albums. Yes.
Yeah, and actually the first comic song I wrote when I was 16. And I wrote it for my friend Matt for his 16th birthday, and it was to the tune of Let It Be, and it's about all the things you can legally do when you're 16 that you can't do beforehand, some of which are now, like smoking, you can't do when you're 16 anymore. But so that was the first, or was it the first? I also remember writing with a couple of friends a very mean song about a boy we didn't like at school.
Oh, right.
So I won't go into that.
I will say this, though, you're in very good company, because Stephen Sondheim used to write songs for people's birthdays.
Oh.
And a few of them are sort of seeped into the public arena, as it were. So.
Oh, well. It's not a tradition I've continued, really, but...
But so you learned quite on that you could write comic songs, and that if anyone, you were more influenced by Tom Lehrer. Can you discern? Well, I think there is a clear difference between Tom Lehrer and Flanders and Swan. But is that because he's slightly more biting, or is slightly more overt biting? Whereas, Flanders and Swan has this lovely line about satire is about pulling off the veneer of society, and they see their job of gently putting it back on again. It's a throwaway line, it's a laugh, but actually it's a very genteel form of observation, I think, that they offer up.
I think perhaps Flanders and Swan is maybe a little more sedate in terms of the humour. Tom Lehrer is maybe you could say slightly more political. I mean, a song
definitely.
like Werner von Braun and stuff and things like that. And I think,
and of course, he did work for the American version of That Was the Week That Was, which was the big satirical show of the early '60s.
And I think also perhaps because he's an academic, it has a slightly more wordy and intellectual bent to it, which I quite enjoy. And
he is unashamedly intelligent, isn't he?
Yeah, and he's always he retired from comedy because he was a professor of maths and was really annoyed that no one knew anything about his mathematical research and just knew him for his silly songs. So you can't win, can you?
You really can't, no. Yeah. He does have that magnificent drawl, though. I say drawl, that's not very odd kind of elongated, I can't do it, but it's beautiful.
And he plays up the Harvardness of his voice. But the other thing I love, he's also a fantastic pianist, and the music underlying the songs is usually pretty spot on as well.
So what's your method for writing a comic song? I mean, it's idea first, presumably. It must be, mustn't it?
Usually, I suppose in the same way that people might write stand-up as coming from life, something happens and you think, oh, that's a bit odd. And so that's sort of the genesis, and then that rolls around your mind for a bit, and then you think of maybe a line that would make a good chorus, or... So there's one song called Secret Cigarette, which is inspired by this column in The Guardian about this, which is written about being a secret smoker and being a daily smoker, but no one ever knowing, and that's a kind of odd situation. And
it's also a comedy of manners, isn't it? In the sense that we now know, as you've already alluded to, that smoking is no longer widely acceptable. It's sort of tolerated, but it's not acceptable, and therefore you might want to hide that aspect of yourself, and that gives you already a kind of, I've got to hide this antisocial thing I do. It's Jekyll and Hyde.
Yeah, and there is this weird, people who are sort of my age, late 20s, early 30s. And they smoke, but they just want to hide that fact from their mothers. And you're sort of, what? And it's, of course, I think that the root of that is that they know that they're doing something stupid and unhealthy and pointless. But there's still this sort of, what you admit to your mother so many more terrible things than doing something totally legal and not harming anyone else. And
it's an odd thing, isn't it? Because smoking used to be taken up because it made you look grown up and cool, and of course for some people it still does, and yet at the other end of the market also has that sense of being able to infantilise you, as you say, in front of your parents.
Yeah,
so it now can do both.
It's a strange one. And
back to Walter Raleigh.
I don't know, it's just one of those things that popped up in life and seemed odd.
So you get the ideas, and then are you one of these people who sort of confuse words with the music as you compose? Or do you have to say, right, I've got my idea, I'm going to draw up a lyric, or I'm going to create
Usually what I'll do is sort of just mess around on the piano with the idea and improvise bits and bobs, and then eventually, hopefully, something will turn up that seems good. So that's kind of how it works. And then once I've got a little bit, then I can, if I've managed to write one verse, I can then go and sit down and write another.
It gives you the model in a way.
Yeah,
exactly. You stumble or discover that, as it were.
Yeah,
and it shows you the way. But of course, it's more than that, isn't it? Because you've got to know how to finish a song. Cole Porter always used to say, for a song, you would have two good ideas. You could have a good idea for the song, but you've got to have a good idea for the end. And he would sometimes come up with the idea for an end of a song before he'd actually come up with a conceit to get there. So I've always thought that's a magnificent piece of advice, actually.
It's a good one, yeah.
How do you finish a song? I mean, in terms of the writing rather than the performance, or does it sometimes just find its way?
I suppose some songs, some comic songs, I suppose, are sort of little stories, and they end with a punchline, and the song is quite a nice medium for doing that, because if the punchline is rhyming, you can build up a huge anticipation of it beforehand, and that can be quite nice.
Yes, there was one song in particular, I'm not going to say which one it was, but you made...
There's some obvious rhymes in that song.
So you are sort of hinting to the audience that they can know what to expect, and of course you can either give them what they want, or sometimes
you can pull it back from them. So I think ending on a punchline is quite good, but then some songs are sort of just more...
anecdotal?
Anecdotal, or just... I think the song does need to have an arc, whether it ends on a punchline or not.
Now, by arc you mean a sort of profile, a story, I suppose, but it's got to go from A to B in some way. It can't just be the same thing repeated.
Yeah, a story, or even if it's just descriptive, it's got the descriptions that sort of heighten in absurdity as you go through and have a sort of shape in that sense, yes.
Now, let's revert back a little bit then to Thomas Durfee and his book. As you say, it's a sort of compendium, and if people think that sounds strange, because it does have a subtitle, doesn't it, as you've said?
Yes, the subtitle is Pills to Purge Melancholy.
So he's actually offering it as a kind of self-help book for, make yourself happy through song.
Interestingly, I did the show in Boston, and one person in the audience had actually written their master's thesis on this book.
Really?
So I got
you do have very high audiences, because you mentioned it's under Elizabethan.
Yes, I suppose if you wrote your master's thesis on a book and you see a show advertised, you'll go along. But so she was explaining to me that at this time it was just when medicine and apothecaries became the sort of thing that most people could go to, and the fashionable thing was to make pills. Like, probably most of them either didn't do anything or were actively harmful, but the idea that you could put medicine into a little capsule or a little sugar pill or whatever, and this could cure things, was this huge fashion. And apparently at this time a lot of things were called pills because it was a good way to sell stuff.
Of course.
So, the pill was a fashionable thing. So it's a good subtitle if you want to sell your book.
Well, I suppose, yeah, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? And also, he is sort of arguing that you can laugh your way out of a melancholy, I suppose, isn't it? Yes, quite. I know that you've said that it's available online, the book, and also you've had the privilege of seeing an actual copy, because they're quite rare, I think, aren't they?
So it's difficult to say, because the book had so many different editions, and it was also reprinted. I mean, you can still buy a printed version on Amazon if you want
really?
to. So it's pretty widely available, and it's on Google Books now as well. So anyone can go and, if you just type in Wit and Mirth or Pills to Purge Melancholy, it'll come up on Google Books, and you can just
riffle
leaf through.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult book to navigate because it doesn't follow any logical pattern of ordering. It's not in alphabetical order. It's not in thematic order. A lot of the songs are not listed in the index.
Fantastic. Yes.
A lot of the songs are listed in the index, but they're listed under a title which may not be the first line of the song, and so it's quite a confusing book to navigate, and it seems to have been done a bit on the cheap, as in he'll just find another song and that goes next in the book, and there's no real ordering principle.
It's just
so
the way they went into his original file.
Yeah, it's
sort
of just like.
And yet, I was trying to think, and we discussed this as well off the record, the idea of what the modern equivalent of that would be, and I always think something like a compendium of quotations. Now, they're often thematically linked, so quotations about laughter or weddings or money or whatever it is, and yet no one ever reads a book like that by starting on page 1 and going through to page 400. You do dip in. It's the kind of thing, funnily enough, you might put next to your lavatory if you're a lavatory reading kind of a person.
Yes, I suppose it is sort of like a toilet book in
yes, in that sense, yes. Now, when he includes the songs, presumably he is also including the music, the score.
Well, that's remarkably inconsistent. So,
is it really fantastic?
For quite a lot of the songs, there is a melody there that you can use. He doesn't provide accompaniment. You have to sort of figure that out for yourself. For some of the songs, there'll be actually several songs sung to one tune. So he'll print the tune once, and it'll say, "Sing this song to the tune on page 200," or whatever it might be. For some songs, he says, "This song is to be sung to a tune." For I don't know, a modern example might be, "Sing this song to the tune of Silent Night." That's not one of the ones in the book, but the name of a tune song, that everyone knows. And some of them just don't have tunes at all.
Oh, really good fun.
So either people would have made them up, or perhaps
they were so well known.
They're so well known that you just. Think one example is, think of when you go to church and you get the hymn book. It's just all the words, and you're supposed to just know the tunes.
That's a really good observation. You're quite right.
So. Yeah. Or when you if you go online nowadays, all these lyrics sites, they don't give you the tune. Everyone knows the tune. You just go and get the lyrics there, which is
absolutely. If you're looking for Hey Jude, you are expected to know the tune of Hey Jude.
Well, karaoke is also the same principle, isn't it?
But the problem with that is, of course, as things disappear. Yes. Did you enjoy delving into the book, or was it a chore?
It was great fun. Yeah. I mean, I was just leafing through, and I mean, it's a lot of it.
Yes, you've and various editions.
It's good fun. Just finding all these weird little things, and
Now, how have your audiences been? Because at the moment we're still in the very first week of the Fringe.
That's right.
And sometimes the Fringe takes a time to rev up.
It's been very weird. It's an unticketed free show, so I never know who's going to come or whether anyone will come. So it's been tricky. I've had one show that was packed to the rafters with people standing outside and looking in through the door. I've had shows with sort of 6 people in. I had one which started off with about 8 or 10 people very quiet, and then 15 very drunk people came in, and that was quite a challenge. So it's been highly variable.
The fart song went well there.
The fart song, well, there was a lot of fart noises from the crowd. I'm not sure if they appreciated the song that much, but highly variable.
Well, I think, once again, taking this back to you, however, because I went on a night when the audience, it grew, but it wasn't enormous at the start. But actually, I can say that everyone in the room, I think, had a really good time. You were very, very much able to sort of play your audience, I thought, magnificently. I was very impressed by your sort of connection and your ability to connect with people and then lead them through your show. And you even had some non-native English speakers there, and you impressed me, by the way, by being fluent in your French and being able to speak to them. Fortunately, they were happy for the show to be conducted in English for the rest of our sakes. But
yeah, I mean, I think so. Two things I think help with that. One is I've done a lot of improv over the years, and that was my start in comedy.
It's also at the start of your show, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's a little improv at the start. That's right. And then
the juice is flowing, doesn't it? So.
Yeah, and the other thing is my full-time job is being a secondary school teacher, and so there's quite a lot of similarities of being in front of a classroom and being on stage in a comedy show.
To command authority sometimes in an environment that might not want that.
Exactly, and sort of persuade. There's a lot of similarities between Edinburgh shows and lessons. They're both about 50 minutes long.
Yes.
They're both, you know, a gaggle of people who are more or less interested in what you're doing.
You don't have to stand outside with leaflets, I suppose. That's
No, people have to come to the lessons. So.
It's frankly obligatory, isn't it? But on the whole, you say it's being received very well. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I think people have liked it.
Yes, I have.
Oh, good. I think enough people have liked it for it to have been worthwhile. So that's a good thing. And funnily enough, I did a late night spot the night you saw the show at a night called Spank, which is one of the late night Edinburgh comedy nights, and did 10 minutes of 17th century jokes, and it went down really well. So I think
it's good to know that the door is open.
It's nice to know that people can appreciate this and have an appetite for it, which is fun. So, yeah.
Well, I thought it was a magnificent show, and I'm actually going to give you 5 stars because I think it was
so
one of those.
lovely.
It was just one of those things that sort of didn't know quite what to expect. I went in and I loved every second. And frankly, if you love every second, what else can I possibly give you?
Well, thank you very much, Thos.
How can people stay in contact with you to find out if this show or Elizabethan or anything else you do sort of is going into the future?
For everything, the easiest way is to go to my website, which is www.davidwilliamhughes.org, not .com, .org, and on there, all the performances I do are listed. There's also links to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, email.
Your online world.
So go there and you can email me if you want to get in contact, or follow me, or whatever you want to do.
Well, David, I've now seen you at 2 Edinburghs.
Thank you.
And I've enjoyed everything you've served up to me, so I hope that's going to be a tradition that we might keep going. Although it puts a lot more work on your shoulders than mine.
I'll try and write another show for you next year, Thos.
But David, as always, thank you so much, and I wish you great success.
Thank you very much.
Afterwards, I went to the gents, and I went up to the urinal, and I'm sort of standing there, doing my thing, and kind of against protocol, I glance over the little useless barrier. I see that the gentleman next to me is controlling the flow with his right hand and thumbing through Instagram with his left. like poo emoji. Why is there not a we emoji? That's a question that needs answering, isn't it? So I wondered, what's up with that? Is the etiquette okay there? And how do we deal with that situation? What's the logical conclusion? So this is a song all about that. I wanted to answer you swiftly, to tell you the what, when and why. The tone of your writing was overexciting, and it seemed a shame not to reply. I'm right-handed, but type with my left hand when I'm otherwise occupied. Words started to flow, but I needed to go, so I'm buttoning down my fly. Your email, dear boss, looked important, and I wanted to write you back quick, to show I'm no shirker, but rather a worker who'd honour your arse with a lick. And though I stand here in the bathroom, I know an excellent trick. I'm holding my phone in my left hand alone. In my right I am holding my prick. As I start to write, it goes smoothly. My grammar is never amiss. My turns of phrase elegant. I am quite eloquent. To read what I write must be bliss. But tragedy strikes at the sign-off when sending that final best wish. As my phone, it is final, falls in the urinal and is soaked in my very own piss.
Well, there we are. Another song sung to you by David William Hughes. And David there was singing one of his own numbers, with a little bit of introduction from his own live show that really helped to contextualise it. Not a song from Thomas D'Urfey's book from the 18th century, Wit and Mirth, but included in David's show of the same name, and certainly in the same vein. Ribald, I think, is the word for that. And it was great talking to David, both about Wit and Mirth and his previous show, Elizabethan. And if you want to know what David's doing now, and more about him in general, go along to his website, www.davidwilliamhughes.org. There's plenty to see and hear and read. He's a man of many talents, as I hope you've already established, but go along to the website and he can prove it to you all over again. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Musical Talk. Between last week and this week, we've covered over 100 years of musical development and musical songs, and I think shown that those songs can still have an impact if delivered well, or if they become immortal. And that, I think, takes us back to Old MacDonald Had a Farm. A song from musical theatre history. Who'd have thought it? Now, talking of musical theatre history, it's about time I became that myself, at least for this week. And that means bringing this episode to an end. Always leave them wanting more, rather than leave them owing more. So not E-I-E-I-I-O-U. So let's bring this show to a much needed end just about now. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. Except for the songs, where the copyright of the performances remains with David William Hughes, and I'm extremely grateful to him for allowing me to play his songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at MusicalTalkThos. Just going to ask you for a quick level, if you don't mind,
Yep.
which is, what do you have for breakfast?
I haven't had any yet because I ate nearly an entire Victoria sponge last night.
Well, that counts as...
So, I suppose Victoria sponge is the answer. Yeah.
It's your ration for the week, that.
Yes. I got in very late and very hungry, and it was the only thing we had, so I ate it.
That is a very traditional Edinburgh story as well.
Yes.